Thus wrote Washington Irving in the 19th century. This great man of letters gave us some unforgettable characters. You may recall, for example, Rip Van Winkle and the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. In a volume entitled A History of New York by Dietrich Knickerbocker, Irving good-naturedly poked fun at the customs he found being enjoyed by Dutch settlers on Manhattan Island. And in so doing, he recorded for posterity many of the Christmas traditions, which are not so very different from what a lot of folks do right now. But as his little poem also implies, there is much more involved in these year-end revels than merely the Christian observance of the birth of Jesus. For now is the time when the days are short and the nights are long, and when most people in the northern hemisphere fight against cold and dark in lands that are frosted with snow. The old year is dying, and the new year is being born. Guilt about the past mingles with hope for the future. These are the days that are filled with mystery and magic, fun and frolic, love and laughter, for now is the time of the winter solstice. Now this is all very easy for us to forget, those of us, for example, who live in sunny Florida. Indeed, around the world, many who live in industrialized cities have all but lost touch with nature. And what this frigid season really might mean and did mean for many of our ancestors. As one writer observed, it is only in the past 300 years that our so-called rational civilization has remembered the solstice by mere custom and mere habit rather than by instinctual involvement with the turning of the seasons. Now, Christianity's great gift to the world, as you know, was Jesus and the ministry of love, but almost all of the elements that are associated with the annual celebration of his birth and are things which have been adopted and adapted from very much older sacred traditions connected to the winter solstice. From the date of Christmas to the character of Santa, from the tree in the corner to the holly and the ivy in our windows, all of these have pagan origins, which take us back to the very essence of human survival in a world once ruled entirely by nature. As leaves fell and plants seemed to die, as cold, darkness, and death appeared to gain a stranglehold upon the earth, ancient rituals were performed to appease the gods, to preserve the sun's life-giving light and heat, and to engender hope in the midst of growing despair. And lo and behold, as we heard earlier, the tide always turned. Life continued on and people prospered. From time immemorial it has been so, and because of that, the winter solstice has always been a season for the rebirth of wonder. And that is what we shall celebrate today as I remind you of some of the sacred traditions which lie behind our contemporary celebration of Christmas. Now, most modern people no longer pay much attention to the movement of heavenly bodies in the sky at night. The dazzle of city lights makes it very difficult for us to see all of the stars and whatever is there. But throughout history, our ancestors watched the night skies constantly. They possessed an intimate and a very detailed knowledge of the passage of the sun and the moon and the stars. Why? Well, because their very lives depended upon it. When the sun was at its highest in midsummer, their crops grew tall and their animals thrived. And at the other extreme in midwinter, they suffered the effects of cold and dampness and darkness and all of the associated ailments of body and soul. It is the movement of the earth, of course, on its tilted axis, going around and around the sun, which produces these seasonal changes. But twice a year, as you also heard this morning, something very unusual happens. For about 6 days in June and then again in December, around the 21st of December, the sun appears to rise and to set at the same points on the horizon. It is as if the sun were standing still. And that precisely is what the term solstice means. The sun stands still. Now, for all pre-industrialized peoples, these two solstices divided the year into a dark half and into a light half, with 6 months of waxing sun and 6 months of waning. The days in between were regarded as being a very, very mysterious time when the sun's future seemed uncertain. It was a chaotic period, when the gates were believed to be open between this world and the next, when communication was thought to be possible between the living and the dead, between human beings and divine beings, when gods were thought to be born or reborn and become incarnate. It was definitely a time to propitiate the gods with rituals and sacrifices of all sorts in the hope that after the solstice things might return to normal. Fire and light were the most important symbols in every celebration, for they represented the most important god, the sun. Greenery was also added to decorations as a sign of the natural life that people hoped would return in the spring. And evergreens were used as a token of the immortal life they also hoped for. Now, all over the world, our ancestors erected altars and temples dedicated to the sun, and many of them had elaborate systems of slots. You may have seen these on TV. These slots were carefully aligned to track the sun's course and to let its light shine upon special symbols that were built into certain rooms or caves just at the time of the solstice. Remnants of these structures still exist throughout Britain and Europe, in both North and South America, and in a few places in the Middle East. Now, in Egypt, the sun god Re was worshipped, and sometimes under the name Aton, A-T-O-N, and hymns were sung to that god with words like the following: Thou dost appear beautiful on the horizon of heaven, O living Aton, thou who wast the first to live. When thou hast risen on the eastern horizon, thou hast filled every land with thy beauty. When thou dost set on the western horizon, the earth is in darkness, resembling death. At daybreak, when thou dost arise upon the horizon, thou dost dispel this darkness and shed thy rays. Though ancient Judaism did not worship the sun, it too acknowledged the importance of the winter solstice. An ancient commentary on the Babylonian Talmud, for example, tells us a story about Adam, who, after his expulsion from paradise, was supposed to have noticed a shortening of the days and to have prayed and to have fasted for 8 days in the hope of calling back the lost life. Now, since this took place at the midwinter solstice, the days soon began to grow longer again, and thereafter Adam repeated this ceremony year after year. Now, above all, of course, solstice is a season to celebrate with dances and costumes. I see you all have arrived appropriately attired. And with feasting and gift-giving. And along these lines, it was the Roman celebration, Saturnalia, which had the greatest of all influence upon our own modern midwinter festivities. From December 17th to the 24th, the Romans honored the god Saturn, who they believed ruled over all of agriculture. Normal behavior was abandoned. Masters served their slaves. Law courts and schools were closed. The whole community gave itself up to feasting and gambling and drinking. It was a time of fun and of laughter and of the exchange of gifts. And indeed, it is this Roman practice and not the gifts of the Magi which is really the source of our own gift-giving habits at Christmas time. The festival of Saturnalia was observed annually until the 4th century, when it was combined with the New Year festival of Kalends in January. Then houses were decorated with lights and greenery, and gift-giving remained prominent. One ancient source described it in words which could be used very well to describe what we see happening today. They said, the impulse to spend seizes everyone. People are not only generous to themselves, but also towards their fellow men. A stream of presents pours itself out. Now, during Kalends, people would dance and they would sing in the streets. They would give money to the poor and dress up in masks and disguises like animals or like members of the opposite sex. Our modern Christmas caroling, Salvation Army kettles, and mummers' parades all originated in just these pagan beginnings. Now, as you might expect, all of these ancient festivities were later condemned by the church. But even worse, celebrations often took place within the churches, as when rambunctious clergy would celebrate what was called the Feast of Fools, or worst of all, the Feast of the Ass. Both of these ceremonies included very silly pranks, disorderly laughter, outrageous parodies of the Mass, and above all, the crowning of boy bishops. Now, such things aside, usually the most glorious part of the ancient winter solstice involved the celebration of the birth of the midwinter king, truly a child of wonder. Always a male child back then, always partly or wholly of divine origin, and always born under extraordinary circumstances. Many different child kings appeared over time, and all of them were taken to be symbols of hope and of light and of life in a world darkened by despair and death. Now, by far the oldest wonder child was the Egyptian god Osiris, who was loved and worshipped throughout the Mediterranean world. With his consort Isis, he brought peace, order, and beauty to the people. But then he was murdered by his jealous brother. And after much struggle, Isis was able to restore Osiris to life. This second nativity was said to have occurred on, well, the 25th of December, and was said to be the date widely celebrated throughout the land. His being combined with his death and resurrection, it celebrated for the people the sun's setting and the sun's rising, on which the fertility of the entire Nile Delta depended. Now, December 25th, as it happens, was also the date which the Roman Emperor Aurelian set in the year 274 as the birthday of the unconquered sun, as well as of Mithras, the god of the morning. There had been a cult of the sun god, Sol, in Rome from its very earliest days. And then around 10 BCE, the Emperor Augustus replaced Sol with the Greek god Apollo. Now, born of the god Zeus and the woman Leto, Apollo was half human and half divine and was often described as a good shepherd. The parallels in the church's later description of Jesus are by no means accidental. By the 2nd century CE, though, Apollo had lost out in popularity to a Persian god, Mithras, who had taken the Roman world pretty much by storm. Also a sun god, Mithras' birth was said to have been attended by shepherds. Just before his time on earth was completed, he took a last supper with his followers, who later immortalized it with a ceremony of bread and of wine. They also made his feast day to be naturally Sun Day, and they all underwent baptism. Instead of dying, Mithras was believed to have ascended into heaven to be with his divine Father. At the end of the world, it was expected that he would return to enact a final judgment and to raise the dead. Rudyard Kipling was impressed by all of this enough that he wrote a poem in which he expressed the Romans' deep love for this particular deity. In the poem, he says this: Mithras, god of the morning, our trumpets waken the wall. Rome is above the nations, but thou art above all. Now, it has been said by some commentators that but for an accident of history that popularized Jesus, the Western world could very well have adopted Mithraism as its religion. And what was that accident? Well, that accident of history was the Emperor Constantine's sudden and very unexpected conversion from Mithraism to Christianity in the year 312. Soon thereafter, Christianity became the official state religion of the Roman Empire, and since no one knew the actual date, December 25th was settled upon by the church and by the state in combination as the official birthday of Jesus, even though Luke's gospel indicates a springtime arrival since the flocks were in the fields. Before Constantine, few Christians had celebrated Jesus' birth at all, really, having been taught that it was his death and Easter that were the most significant things. And so it was that after 350, Christmas was added to the many other celebrations of the winter solstice, and Jesus took his place among many other such children of wonder. Now, I had hoped, of course, this morning to be able to tell you so much more in a sermon about, for example, how the evergreen tree and the holly and the ivy and the mistletoe came to be parts of Christmas. But you have Google, look it up, you'll enjoy that. And I had hoped to tell you especially about how all of them came from their much older winter solstice celebrations, involving even earlier traditions about how the green king of winter had to fight for the hand of the spring maiden, and how all of this found expression in stories of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and how Robin Hood and Maid Marian were built into all of this. And I'll bet you didn't know King Arthur and Friar Tuck had anything at all to do with Christmas, but they do. Look it up. Google is there for you. I had also hoped to tell you how so much of our modern tradition about Santa Claus grew out of the experiences of a very real person, a teenager named Nicholas, who was consecrated as one of these boy bishops and who became famous for giving presents to people and was made a saint later by the church. And even more, I had hoped to explain to you how it was that the Santa tradition originally derived from prehistoric shamans dressed all in their furs who climbed down the central poles of their tents, bearing gifts of prophecy about the new year and little presents for the children. And lastly, I had hoped to take each one of you on a little tour of the 12 days of Christmas, but alas, my time has run away as fast as Santa's reindeer. And with that in mind, therefore, I shall leave you with these words from a wonderful French Christmas carol. Noel is leaving us, it's sad to say, but he will come again, oh yes, someday. His wife and children weep as they go on their gray horse, riding through the snow. Even the kings, the three kings, ride away in the snow and in the rain. Oh, but after 12 months, we shall see them again. And so, here's wishing to all of you a very wonderful winter solstice.